But it's very kind of you to have me come. Last week I was talking to one of our students who had been in the seminary chorus, and I don't know if it was last year or the year before, they came to North Carolina. And he said, they're some of the friendliest people I've ever met. He said, I don't know what's in the water down there, but he said they were just so kind, so generous, and friendly. So he said, greetings from him, and I wanted you to know that. Today we are, another thing I wanted to mention before I start. With regards to the matter of recent events in our church, especially Yankee Stadium, the seminary that I am from and teach at has been rather reticent to make any comment publicly, and that's been noted in many places. I am here to tell you that this month, the October issue of the Concordia Journal, the journal of our seminary, will finally make a statement by our faculty with regards to at least one aspect of it. There will be at least two statements in the Theological Observer section, one by the whole faculty and another by two of the faculty members who've signed it, although several of us had supported it. And it's very highly critical, both of them, of Dr. Kieschnick and Dr. Benke in the way in which things have been handled. And I want you to know that this is, to me, a great rejoicing that our seminary has finally addressed the matter. It has been observed by one of my colleagues in recent years. He said that our seminary seems to be very reticent to rock the boat, to make comments in the church that would, upset the peace, I guess, of the church. Now, of course, if you're to be leaders in the church, and if you're to exercise the authority and the leadership that we should, then you're going to rock some boats, I'm afraid. I'm reminded of St. Paul's letter to the Timothy and Titus, in which he over and over talks about this dual task that pastors have. One is to positively proclaim the word of God to the people and lead them into good pastures as a good shepherd. But on the other hand, he is to protect the sheep from the dangerous waters and the dangerous people who talk by refuting those who reject the good news, the proper word. To refute, it's the same verb that is used of our Lord about Peter when he tried to say, you cannot go up to Jerusalem to be crucified. And so in that case, we must refute false sayers and falsehood. And for three reasons. Number one, it shows love to the God who has given us the truth to begin with. Number two, it shows love to the brother who is in error, who is in falsehood. But number three is a group of people we often overlook. That's especially the case now. It is for those people in our church who have been offended by the falsehood, and they want to hear from their theologians and their pastors, this was wrong. And so we need to speak in situations like that, so that these people will know that there are those who have spotted the error and confirm it. So it's speaking to them as well. Which all goes to remind me of the fact that coming down here, I was put in a boat with Billy Graham and the Pope. And we tried to make a joke out of this, and I don't think I came up with anything very good. There was once a time when the Pope and Billy Graham and Ron Feuerhahn were in a boat together. Now what happens after that? Now that's your competition. By the end of the next 35 minutes or the next hour, you have to come up with the end of that. And the reason why we're all together is the fact that we all have Parkinson's disease. And so I'm in great company here, I guess. But the only thing I come is don't rock the boat. When the Pope got up, I said, don't rock the boat. Well, anyway, that's another matter. Our topic is very important. First of all, in the history of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, there's been a strong theological leadership in North America. When the men of Wilhelm Leah, those in Indiana and Ohio particularly, were instructed by him to contact those Saxons over in Missouri, get together with them, and form a new church. They came to St. Louis in around 1846. I look over and I kind of glance over to Larry Rast and see if that's all right. Is that okay? That's pretty good. He knows these things, these dates and everything backwards and forwards. They were at the first meeting, they were very impressed by the Saxon men, if not enthralled and even perhaps a little intimidated by their theological prowess. In other words, the way in which they were so confidently distinguished law and gospel. They, unlike the Sindlinge or the Nothilfe of the Leah men, were university educated. And Leah's men were not at that time of that type. They'd come over as emergency helpers. And so there was a leadership gift there already then. And when Walther called the free conferences in response to the recension of the Augsburg Confession of Schmucker and Sprecher and Kurtz, about 1855, he called these in the years 1856 to 59. There was a great response. He led the way. And he was one of the leading theologians. He spoke with authority. In fact, in the early days of the Wisconsin Synod, it was actually Walther who was more the father figure of that synod than their own leader. Their own leader who was, he was a unionist, and unlike what we have the image of Wisconsin Synod today, he was not very theologically oriented and like. And Walther was viewed by the whole first 2 or 3 generations, at least, of the Wisconsin Synod as their real father. During the period then later in the century, the 19th century, when there was a series of colloquies with other synods, mainly from the Midwest, Missouri was at the heart of this. They were the leaders in getting together with the synods of Illinois, of Ohio, of Iowa, and all over, and leading them to a common confession, which eventually came to be in the Synodical Conference. And that was a considerable achievement then. And it was under the leadership of men like Walther, who were great dogmaticians. They were great theologians. The English Synod, or later on became the English district of the Missouri Synod in 1911, of which one of the Henkels, that name should be very revered in your company, was a party. My hometown is Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and I understand the first settlement or the first organized worship of Lutherans there was under the leadership of one of the Henkels. I'm very pleased about that. They recognized in the Missouri Synod a strong confessional group. And so in summary about this, throughout the early history of the Missouri Synod, and certainly right up to World War II, Missouri was thought of as a church which was solid in doctrine, knew the doctrine of the faith, taught it faithfully, and rejoiced in that strength of doctrine. Unlike what I heard recently at a conference of district presidents in the 2 theological faculties, which one district president got up and said, the problem with the Missouri Synod today is that it's too concerned about keeping its doctrine pure. Now, I never thought I would ever hear that from anyone. I've tried over and over to try to think of what the man really meant. What I pointed out at the time was, but sir, it's not our doctrine, it's God's doctrine. It's His teaching. It's what He has to say, His word, His teaching in the Bible about Himself and about His plan of salvation for us. That's doctrine. What we're given to do is to confess it. And confess it means to say it, to speak it like God has given it to us. And to do that as perfectly, as surely, as confidently as possible. I mean, how do we help anyone if we're not confident in confessing that well? He was concerned that we showed no love and sympathy for others by always harping on our doctrine. And so there came to be a shift of emphasis represented dramatically by that man's comment. In the period after World War II, there was some dramatic changes in the Missouri Synod. By the way, I think this has been marvelously chronicled by Dr. Marquardt in his book called The Anatomy of Explosion, a marvelous book that really outlines all the problems and what led up to it. There was a deliberate effort to shed Missouri passion for dogmatic theology. In its place was the emphasis upon a so-called biblical theology. An example of this shift was in the work and teaching of Jaroslav Pelikan, for instance, who, while still teaching at Concordian Seminary in St. Louis, introduced a course on biblical theology, informing his students that the contrast with the past emphasis. Beforehand, you learned dogmatic theology. Now you're going to learn biblical theology. Now you see, that goes back to the early part of the 20th century, the latter part of the 19th century, when liberal theologians, liberal churchmen, began to espouse something called biblical theology instead of dogmatic theology. Dogmatic theology had the problem for there being something that is defined by someone else, not me. And the way in which they saw biblical theology, which is not really biblical theology either, was something that I'll go to the Bible and I find out for myself. And Pelikan, in his book From Luther to Kierkegaard, made it very clear that the Missouri Synod in the past had been too dependent upon the theologians of the 17th century, the generation of churchmen and fathers after Luther. And therefore, we must be rid of that emphasis. Now, in some respects, even if the Missouri Synod was a bit too keen on that era, or didn't recognize some of its weaknesses, it still was a much stronger area in theology than anything that was being put forward in its place. Another one of my former colleagues, retired now, Horace Hummel, wrote an article in one of our journals about biblical theology and dogmatic theology, question mark. Are they for or against one another? In which he says, in this history, the past history, they were pitted against one another. But he said they don't need to be. In fact, they should not be. But the point is, we in Missouri got rid of dogmatic theology in effect. And we've suffered since then. We don't have the type of leadership. Dogmatic theology teaches us how to ask the right questions, how to make the right kind of distinctions. And it's only in recent years that we've begun to recover that as area of study. And there are two men who, in my mind, did the most noble efforts to recover that. They were my colleague at St. Louis, Norman Nagel, and especially Robert Preuss at Fort Wayne, who through their work and efforts have reinstated that. So that at the Fort Wayne Seminary now you have a strong dogmatic or systematic department of theology. And that's a marvelous gift to the church. To me, the greatest peers that I had, the greatest mentors I had, were all dogmaticians. They were men who knew their dogmatic theology well. That meant they spoke with authority. Even as pastors, not just as theologians, but as pastors to their people. And so, what about the future of Missouri then? After World War II, things were kind of sad. And before I go into the future, I would like to point out a few more of those problems or observations. For instance, a guy that I'm rather fond of right now, a man named Herman Sasse. I envy Dr. Marquardt. He actually knew the man well in Australia. I'm going to start a sabbatical on December 1st for 2 quarters, and I hope then to start a biography of this Herman Sasse. Some of you may know of some of the books that Concordia Publishing House has been bringing out of translations of some of his essays, called The Lonely Way. And it's called that because he was a man who had been a confessing Lutheran in Germany at a time when it was very unpopular to be a confessional Lutheran. And he found this a very lonely way. And he talked about the lonely pastors and the like throughout the world in that way. I would commend the books to you for your reading, laymen as well as pastors. It's one of the great gifts of Sasse. He wrote so that you could understand it, not like many of his colleagues in Germany. He makes a remark at one time, he said, "You must be sober and think clearly in the Missouri Synod if your church is to remain what it is, the last stronghold of the Lutheran Reformation in the world." He said that right after the war. He saw that in Germany, Lutheranism was dead. It was gone. It had been gobbled up by the Reformed. And he said, the last hope for Lutheranism in the world is the Missouri Synod. Another letter he writes to his young colleague, Tom Hardy, said, "We are trying hard to keep Missouri on the right track." But already at that time, he saw that Missouri was straying from its path. "We are a small band of brethren," he said, "but I discover more and more lonely Lutherans of our type. Missouri is now trying to build up conservative Lutheran churches in all parts of the world. They have seen that blunder they made after 1945 when they permitted themselves to be fooled by the European bishops. Then the synods of Brazil, Argentina, Canada are becoming independent churches in communion with Missouri. A hard fight is going on within Missouri because many of their young men are infected by the Geneva germ, but I am still hopeful. Geneva germ is that of the ecumenical movement, the World Council of Churches, which he was an expert on. And later on he wrote to an ULCA man, Bachman, in 1961. "What gives me the greatest concern for the Lutheran Church in America is its complete silence in all questions which vitally concern the existence of the Lutheran Church." And by the way, that's one of the things that's disturbed me, is the fact of the silence of my seminary. I'll go on with his quotes in a minute, but if I may sidestep here. Sasse noted that after the war, what he says here, he said, "From the ULC to Missouri, everybody is silent about the scandalous ordinations of women in Sweden, about the unionism in Germany and all European countries, about the growing neoliberalism in all our churches." They were silent. There was a litany in his latter years of his life. Over and over he would say, "And Missouri was silent. And Missouri was silent." We were strongly criticized when at our last convention we got up and we said, we took a vote and said that we thought that the ELCA could no longer really be considered to be a confessional Lutheran church. Well, finally, Missouri was not silent about that, and it said something. About 3 or 4 days after that vote was taken, and I was one of 3 men on the platform to speak for it, I was addressing a group of about 350 ELCA clergy in Minneapolis. And in the question period, I hadn't really expected it, but all of a sudden it was there, and it was very natural. One of the men got up and said, "I understand your church last week condemned us as being un-Lutheran." So I explained rather nervously what the actual resolution said, that you could not be deemed or questioned whether it could be deemed to be a confessional Lutheran church. And I told the reasons why. And I gave these things, these statements I'd given you before about the love of God who gave us the teaching, the love of those brothers who have erred, and those who are offended by it. I said, and there may even be some in your own church, is what I thought. And all of a sudden they got up in a roar of applause, stood up. Almost all of the people there felt that way. They were grateful that the Missouri Synod had said that, and that we had declared about their own church, and we'd given support to these people within their church because there were people outside who could see this. And finally they said, somebody is on our side and has shown that. And so this is one of the great grievous things of our church's life, is the fact that we have been silent in the past often when we should not. And if it's just a matter of rocking the boat, I'm afraid we're going to have to rock the boat. Sasse goes on later on, he said, "This leads me to the problem of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod as such. I am convinced on the basis of many years of study of the American churches that your church has a key position in America. Success and failure of your church will determine the destiny of Lutheranism in your country. Your church has been able to assimilate American forms of church life, education, etc., without giving up the faith of the fathers. Why should it be impossible to translate Lutheran doctrine into a theology which shows that the gospel, as understood in our confessions, is the answer to the deepest questions of your nation? Your church is suffering from a defect which is characteristic of all American churches, and which has its deepest roots in the American civilization, probably also in other spheres of life: a lack of productive thinkers. The Christian Century has recently discussed a discussion of the problem why America is so dependent upon European theology. And this is one of the things when Herman Preuss up at Luther Seminary wrote Dr. Sasse after World War II. And he wrote him 3 times. He said, "Dr. Sasse, he said, when should we start sending students back to Germany to your universities?" Finally, Sasse answered, he said, "Don't send them here. There are no Lutherans left. Only Ehlert and I. Don't send them here." And that was one of the problems. The young men from Missouri and other places went to Germany. They were unprepared for what they found there. They didn't know the philosophy, the language that these men were speaking. It sounded familiar, but it had a different meaning now. And they were duped, they were taken in, they were converted to a new theology. And they brought it back and they began to sow it, especially at St. Louis, but also at Springfield at the time as well. Sometimes Sasse says one has the impression that Missouri is like the USA. You can make your plans only from one convention to the next because there may be a change in the administration. How prescient, how foresight that was. This lack of unanimity, of discipline and clarity in Missouri has caused tremendous damage. I wonder what the means may be to create again a real consensus within your church. For without such consensus, Missouri cannot really play a leading role in world Lutheranism. Such a consensus must not necessarily mean absolute theological uniformity enforced by church discipline, as some people, for instance, the men of the Confessional Lutheran magazine, think, but it must mean a real consensus concerning the dogma of the Lutheran Church and concerning the practical principles following from it. Now, in that, he is again so observant. We have the problem in our church of every time the administration changes, it's as if our theology changes. It's not quite that bad, but we must come to a consensus in the theology of our church. What does the future hold? I said that before, now I'll get back to it. From the perspective of the post-World War II period, it appeared, at least, very healthy and ready to launch a very positive contribution to the North American church scene. We listened to Winthrop Hudson's description in 1961 in a very famous book, or noted book, in a series published by the University of Chicago, where he was a professor, about the North American civilization. And this was a book titled American Protestantism. And in the very last paragraph of this book, this man, who is not a Lutheran at all, makes the following comment. Here's what he says in the very last paragraph. The final prospect for a vigorous renewal of Protestant life and witness rests with the Lutheran churches, which had overcome much of their fragmentation by 1960 and had grouped themselves into 3 main bodies. All had exhibited an ability to grow during the post-World War II years, with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod making the greatest gains. The Lutheran churches are in the fortunate position of having been, in varying degrees, insulated from American life for a long period of time. Insulated. Today, we hear that it was such an iniquitous thing that we were so insulated, that we weren't part of the main line of American Christianity. As a result, they, that is, these Lutherans, he goes on, have been less subject to the theological erosion, which so largely stripped other denominations of an awareness of their continuity with the historic Christian tradition. The theological erosion that stripped them of an awareness of their continuity with historic Christian tradition. Thus, the resources of the Christian past have been more readily available to them, and that fact suggests that they may have an increasingly important role in Protestant recovery. And now he goes on to point out three assets immediately at hand among Lutherans, and they are a confessional tradition. That's positive, that's good, he says. A surviving liturgical structure, and a sense of community, which however much it may be the product of cultural factors, he says, all these Germans or all these Scandinavians came together, may make it easier for them than for most Protestant denominations to recover the integrity of church membership. Let's go back. Confessional tradition. We are strongly, strongly under the influence of the ecumenical movement today. And it says confessions are out. You have to be. They create barriers to our getting together. Indeed, they do. They're meant to, in the right way. And so they say, well, we can't have that. And a surviving liturgical tradition. How many Lutheran churches do you know of that have been chucking the liturgy as quickly as possible, trying to get rid of it? And that this is one of the great gifts that our church has. So, what this man says is right, but what happened then is something else. The church faces changes. We hear that over and over. We're living in a different era. This is not the church of our forefathers. Such statements have been persistently there, and they have troubled and challenged the Lord's people. It is thought by some that these conditions are such as were never before faced by God's people, nor dealt with by what they confessed and practiced accordingly. I would challenge the fact that they've never been faced before. But if we live in a new missionary age, what does that mean? It might mean something like this. The church today lives and works no longer in the context of what has been called the Judeo-Christian worldview. Or number two, we now live in a post-Christian, even a post-modern era. It is a secular era. We do not no longer live in the sea of faith, as Matthew Arnold called it, where we're aware of God in every part of our lives. We don't care about God in our lives anymore. Or number three, the church has been strongly influenced by the ecumenical attitude, an attitude which, at least in latter years, has given emphasis to friendliness between denominations as the primary goal. The church today, number four, lives and works in an anti-polemical age. The world no longer desires or even permits the church to refute any falsehood. It's politically incorrect. You may not say to a brother, "You're wrong." Today we long to be more tolerant. And fifth, today also churchmen give less attention to doctrine or confessions. Such features may not be unique in the history of the church, but they do call for a re-examination of the church's context. It is perhaps just a case of relativizing in the postmodern world of all these things. Of course, there's truth in the comment that we've said. And the problem is, how does one recognize truth today? The problem is posed almost daily. For instance, if the goal of ecumenical dialogue is indeed such as church unity and reconciled diversity, however arrived at, the question of truth cannot and must not be shut aside, and precisely for the sake of that unity. So that the new Catholic Adult Catechism, therefore, correctly emphasizes that the unity of the church must be a unity in truth. The path of the ecumenical movement consequently does not lead through pragmatic compromises or a false irenicism, a false peacemaking, which obscures or waters down the truth of the gospel and the purity of the church's doctrine. If unity and consensus are criteria for this dialogue, the question about truth cannot be brushed aside. It must not. And so here we are in the new age of mission, we hear. And yet it was the concern of the earliest Missouri Synod Fathers and even of the Synodical Conference. There were two things that they would get together for: to do theology, study doctrine, and to do mission. Those are the two things. There was no contrast between the two, no separation. You were effective as missionaries because you knew your theology, you knew the doctrine of God, and you confessed it. That meant you spoke with authority. And that is definitely what we need today. Pastors and men who know the theology, the doctrine of the church. Why? Because that's exactly the place where the authority of God would give us. An acquaintance of mine, a man named Edward Norman, he's now the canon at York Minster in England, once wrote, "One of the reasons for the astonishing frailty of the faith of modern men and women is precisely because they make it relate directly to feelings rather than to teachings. The age is impatient of dogma, yet dogma is the substance of revealed truth. Men and women today display great ease in laying aside religious formulae for which their predecessors in former centuries were prepared to surrender their very lives. They see human needs as transcending what they regard as antiquated and unnecessary attachment to doctrine. And they see this in a fashion which elevates the satisfaction of interior human sentiment as the chief function of religious observance." I'd love to read to you from Dorothy L. Sayers, but my time is just about up. Or Carl Broughton has written some brilliant things recently about this. The way in which today we are duped into thinking that dogma is no longer important. As a sign of the times, he says, as I read it, I see trends that cause me to grieve for the church that mothered me. I see a church losing interest in theology, no longer capable of taking dogma and doxology seriously, a church often ashamed of its heritage and hankering for relevance, whose worship is weak and vacuous, subjective and sentimental. Well, how true he is. The function of creeds and confessions is to provide a standard by which the church can judge and condemn false teachings contrary to the gospel. The church has always found it necessary to draw a dividing line between what is acceptable teaching and what is unacceptable. Heresy, however, has become virtually outmoded in the modern church for two reasons. First, the rise of democracy meant that the church lost its power to treat heretics as criminals. And second, the Enlightenment brought the age of toleration, in which the rules that set limits to heresy were overthrown. Orthodoxy was put on the defensive. Heresy became a matter of religious freedom and human rights. And so it's not heresy, but schism today that is a greater concern, they say. That is, you don't want to be separate. They want to be inclusive and have diversity at the expense of the revealed truth and biblical morality. This is the problem for today. One thing is more life-threatening on the church than heresy, and that is the unwillingness or inability to tell the difference between orthodoxy and heresy. Now, I don't want to end on that note, but it's a pretty sad note. But I'm reminded of what Sasse used to say and do. He would describe the heresies and the tragedies within the life of the church. The greatest tragedy in the church, John Kleinig would imitate him in his German accent. And after about 5 or 15 greatest tragedies in one lecture, he would finally look at the young men before him and say, "But young," he said, "our Lord is still praying for his church." Hear that word of promise. Our Lord is still praying for His church. And insofar as we faithfully confess what He has given us to confess, our work will be blessed. It will be blessed as God sees fit to bless it. My time is up, and I hand over to this group over here to have go at it.